Today I am driving for the first time on the channel a Lamborghini Aventador. However, the last time I was behind the wheel of one of these, it was off camera and it left me bitterly disappointed. But that was the early car. This is the facelifted Aventador S, and Lamborghini fans tell me it should be a whole lot better. So, let's find out. The funny thing about the Aventador is that very quickly it gained a reputation for being the car of choice for posers. The sort of people that buy a car not to hoof it round a track, but instead to poodle down the King's Road, revving it up at every opportunity, occasionally setting fire to it. I always thought that was something of a shame because, at its heart, this is a car which possesses a lot of technological geekery. For starters, I am sat in a carbon fibre cell, and when this car was in production, that was still a very novel thing. In fact, even today, very few production cars, even production supercars, have a carbon core. But this did 11 years ago. The car also had Formula One style pushrod suspension and a 6.5 litre V12 that in its original guise made a clean 700 horsepower. That meant when the car was launched, many journalists compared it not with the other supercars on the market, but instead with hypercars. Of course, in 2011, there was no series production mid-engine Ferrari V12. What we had was stuff like the 599, which was a very different character of car. Even the F12, which I love deeply, is simply so different, direct comparisons are, to a point, meaningless. The original LP700-4 garnered many awards and was much loved by the supercar fraternity. However, only a few years later, and people began to remember the car more for the negatives rather than the positives. So, you mention Aventador, and people were quick to point out that it used what Lamborghini call an independent shifting rod gearbox. In other words, a single clutch automated manual, a la Ferrari's old F1 system, BMW's SMG, so on and so forth. They would, of course, neglect to mention the fact this is a system built explicitly for the Aventador, and it featured the fastest shift times of any production car with such a gearbox. 50 milliseconds. To put that into some context, the 430 Scuderia, which is already incredible, does it in 60 milliseconds, and that was already faster than many other Ferraris that were doing it in 80, and the earlier systems only achieved about 150. So it was pretty good on that front, if in numbers and nothing else. People would also talk about the fact that in Corsa mode, every upshift felt like it was going to break your neck, and the car. The suspension was also given criticism for being far too harsh around town, and that's to say nothing of the interior, which featured a number of parts very obviously pinched from Audi, like the infotainment system up here that the S still uses, some of the door controls as well, and a number of other things too. In 2013, the Aventador received a fairly significant technical upgrade that changed certain things like the programming of the gearbox, the way the suspension was set up, and a few other detail changes. According to all, that is already a significantly improved car, but it's the S that really moved the game on. And I hope that's true, because when I did drive a 2013, only a couple of months ago, I felt it to be a little bit lackluster. It simply didn't put a smile on my face, and this is a Lamborghini. If it can't do that, there's just no point. I made an entire vlog of my experience with that car, but in a nutshell, what didn't I like? First off, the fact that the interior felt just a little bit cheap. This car repeats many of the same issues, so the steering wheel airbag cover feels like it's made from just cheap, nasty material, and given that's right in front of you, it should at least be leather covered or leather looking. The switches here are all nice enough, but there's far too many of them. It's very confusing, and in 2011, the Audi system up here was embarrassing. In 2016, it was downright inexcusable. The gearbox I also simply failed to get on with and was particularly frustrated by, because in sport mode, it delivered the best downshifts of nearly any gearbox ever. consistently, but the upshifts were always slow, no matter how fast you were going or how hard you were driving. Conversely, in Corsa mode, the upshifts were every bit as brutal as people had told me to expect, but the downshifts were inexplicably slow, meaning there was no perfect mode for the gearbox. Given the fact that Aventadors seem to refuse to depreciate, even that 2013 car, so a 9-year-old example, was still commanding over £180,000. And it just didn't excite, which is a real shame, because I would have loved to have had a car like that parked on the driveway. How good would that have looked next to the F12? But 'twas not to be. So then, what's so special about the Aventador S? Just to get us all up to speed, I'll explain where it came in the Lamborghini lineup, because if you're not familiar with these things, it can be a touch confusing. Your original Aventador, the LP700-4, landed in 2011. That was then followed by the more hardcore Aventador SV, which came a couple of years on. It was in 2016 that the Aventador S landed. It was all in one, an upgrade, a replacement and a facelift for the original car. To put it in Porsche terms, this isn't really the Carrera S, this is the Aventador .2, the second generation. It is from this car the SVJ was then spun off, and if certain people are to be believed, the SVJ, which is the hardcore variant of this generation, might actually be a more common car than the cooking S. Confused yet? The S received upgrades across the board, including the introduction of an Ego mode for the car, which the previous version didn't have. That was necessary because the suspension is now adaptive, whereas before it was simply passive, and it looks like it's no longer made by Öhlins. You also got an extra bump in power, so this now makes 740 PS, and torque stayed the same, at an already fairly healthy 509 pound-foot at 690 Nm. But the big difference for many was the introduction of all-wheel steer, which was supposed to make this car just that little bit more agile, enjoyable, and more driver-focused. So, as we're on a good piece of road, going to stick the car into its individual Ego mode, which has the powertrain in Corsa, steering in Sport, and the suspension in Strada. And let's see if the Aventador S can find that smile the original could not. Remains inexplicable. I was driving it there with the powertrain in Corsa, but now I'm in Sport. Listen to this downshift. That is beautiful. Here, let's have an upshift now. Full throttle, 6,000 RPM. Downshift, glorious, absolutely glorious. Lots of pops and cracks, gorgeous noise, fantastic. Now let's put you into Corsa mode. So that was a slightly slower upshift. You need about 6,000 RPM behind this car to get the most brutal of the upshifts. So let's give you one of those. Here we go. Wah! That's pretty epic. But the downshift, did you even hear that? Just not great, is it? I'm so frustrated, so frustrated. Lamborghini, come on. Oh, now there was something I didn't try on the test drive. I had a theory that perhaps like in the Ferraris, you need to blip the thing to get the best downshift. So let's see if I can blip it. Not really making a difference there. Throttle response is pretty good though, and the car certainly doesn't feel like it's lacking for pace. One thing I noticed in comparison with the F12, and in terms of engine, we certainly can compare them. The F12 is a 6.3 litre V12, this is a 6.5. In the original guys, the F12 made slightly more power. Here, this makes essentially the same, and they're pretty neck and neck on torque, with this one making, I believe, marginally more. What surprised me was I figured them being roughly similar in weight, this is about 1.8 tons, the F12 closer to 1.7, they would feel similar in terms of acceleration. When you're at the pointy end of the rev counter, that is very much the case. But at low RPM, the Lamborghini just felt inexplicably lethargic. Yeah, 4,000 RPM and this engine comes alive. The pedals are also worth mentioning. So I got a little shot earlier, and there is essentially straight for my right foot, and that basically takes you nearly outside the car. The accelerator is where you'd expect the brake to be in the vast majority of cars, and the brake is way over to the left. The car is currently in full Corsa mode, so it's not actually as punishingly stiff as I feared it might be. Now I'm back into the custom settings, so Corsa powertrain, sport steering, and Strada suspension. That really is a good combination. Though the pedal may be very offset, the brakes in this car are absolutely fantastic. Naturally, massive carbon ceramic stoppers are employed here, but they seem a little bit more intuitive and better set up than those in the Huracan that I drove last. Speaking of combinations, I love the colour of this car. Orange is so right for a Lamborghini. One of the things that really shocked me when I was looking at Aventadors was just how few of them are in a bold colour. You would have thought if you'd already committed to buying a car as wild, wacky and outlandish as this, that you'd be happy to have it in a nice bold purple, red or blue or something. But very, very few of them were. Most of them were in, I suppose, Batman replica spec, so dark greys, blacks and the like. To me, that's just heartbreaking. It's between 5 and 6 is evidently the crossover point to engage that rapid gear shift. It does feel a little bit more smooth than the early cars. Those really were brutal. The steering, however, is quite nice, and that is a surprise. It wasn't terrible in the first car. If anything, it was better than I expected. And this is not exactly McLaren-like, but it talks to you. It's got a nice weighting to it. I'm enjoying steering this car. Yeah, okay, so it must be around 6 is the crossover, because that was 5.5, and it still did not want to give me the quick shifts. Frustrating, very frustrating. Also frustrating is the space in this car, because there isn't any, despite the fact that it is pretty big. It's 2 meters wide, it's not very tall, and you do suffer for that. If you're 5'10" or over, your mileage may vary. The Aventador may not be the car for you. I am 5'10", but with a lengthy torso, and I've got, well, when sat upright, no space, none at all. I got in an Aventador with a helmet on once. My spine never recovered. The front boot, though slightly larger than the Huracans, is also nothing to write home about, and is very disappointing when you consider the old Diablo had actually quite a bit of space there. Does make a great noise, this thing. A few too many pops and cracks than I would like, but it sounds epic and very distinctly Lamborghini. You'd never confuse this with a Ferrari V12 or an Aston Martin. Grip on a day like today, where it's nearly 30 degrees and is pretty dry, is absolutely fine. With the S, because they say the chassis was more inherently balanced, they sent more power to the rear wheels more of the time. I'm pretty sure it does feel like this car has a little bit more poke low down too, because I was not impressed with the pull of the last one. Let me just let this Range Rover come past, and I'll give you some beans in second, which is about the only gear I can show off in. Here we go. Yeah. Wow. That wasn't that wasn't full tilt upshift. I do worry when I go for those big gear shifts that one of my cameras is just going to go whee and straight past me. Thus far, it hasn't happened. Like any of these gearboxes, do not use auto mode, and at low RPM do help it lift on a shift, and it will be a lot smoother and more enjoyable. I'm not sure if I'm such a big fan of the looks of the Aventador S. Not that it's a bad looking car, quite the opposite in fact, but I do admire the purity of the original. I also like the fact that car still had the opening vents on the side a la Murcielago, which this dropped. That's a shame. I do enjoy the movable rear wing. I like the fact that the button down here seems to do a little bit more for it than in the last one. However, the interior does continue to disappoint. This is a V12 Lamborghini. This is the flagship. You buy a V12 Ferrari and they make sure you know you've bought the best one. Not that there's anything wrong with a V8 Ferrari, but they try and make sure that everything in the V12 is just that touch nicer. However, here, yeah, okay, it's maybe a little better in places than a Huracan, but the Huracan is also very, very disappointing on that front. Naturally, one of my other major criticisms of the Aventador and other Lamborghinis stays true here. The fact that if you are a slightly taller driver, you can't really see much. I mean, look, here's where my eyes are, and here's where this is. So if you're up in the Highlands or in the Alps or somewhere like that, and you look, you won't be able to see them. You'll be like, oh, I think there's a bit of an Alp over there. I'm sure it looks beautiful, but you could say, of course, well, just go and buy the Roadster then. Yeah, but that has a silly two-piece carbon roof that if you take it off, takes up the entirety of your front storage. So if you're going to try and do a Euro trip, it's not so good. Yes, there's a tiny, tiny little parcel shelf behind you, but it doesn't really do all that much. But, and this is a big but, this is a V12 Lamborghini. The last one of these I drove was the Countach, and I think it's fair to say that's a car that you drive for about an hour, at the end of which you feel absolutely exhausted. However, you've had the ride of your life. Is this the revelation that some were telling me to expect? No, not really. But is it simply a slightly better Aventador? Yeah. And is that a bad thing? No, not really. Do I feel like I made the right decision to not buy one? Yeah, because a few of the things in here, particularly the gearbox, would definitely frustrate me. And ultimately, one of the things I love doing with all of my cars is taking them on a nice big trip, usually up to Scotland. For those purposes, this just wouldn't work all that well. Truth be told, I do believe the Aventador is one of those cars that doesn't really have a genuine rival. So the only thing really to compare it with is itself. And in that case, what should you buy? This or the original? Well, all of this car's fine qualities are still present and correct on that. The difference being, to get one of these, you're going to have to pay another £100,000. And if you are the sort of person, which would be your typical Lamborghini owner, that intends to take this out just every now and again to have a bit of fun in, is it worth it? Not really. No. Not that it's a bad car, but another 100,000 over the regular one? Wouldn't bother. I just wouldn't bother. Much as I might moan about these things, and there are many valid reasons to do that, I think it's also worth taking a moment to point out the fact that I get to drive a lot of very nice cars on a fairly regular basis. And still, something like this, a V12 Lamborghini, still has an aura, a mystique, and something very, very special about it. In the modern world of everybody trying to make more cars than ever before, there's still a reasonably rare and special thing. Over the 11 years these were in production, Lamborghini only made about 10,000 of them. That's important to note, because one day this will no longer be a fast car, but it will always be very cool and very rare. In any case, I have enjoyed this drive, which really was the ultimate aim. So, all that remains then for me to say is a massive thank you to this car's owner, Jana, for bringing it out. As ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and even if you have, make sure you've ticked the bell icon so you'll be notified of every new video release. And I hope to see you for the next one, whatever it may be. Bye-bye.